Today I wanted to introduce a new topic which is called sharding. The sharding is one of the standard techniques used in the research community to increase the transaction throughput in blockchain systems. Okay, so till now we've been looking at a single blockchain. There is a Genesis block, and we've been wondering how to include the transaction rate, because Bitcoin has a very low rate of something like 7 transactions per second. And there were lots of clever ideas which we looked at in order to increase the rate of transactions. One of them was Bitcoin NG, but it had a lot of shortcomings. And then we looked at Prism, which claims to give very high throughput, pretty much the maximum that you can think of. Right, and of course there were some shortcomings over there, in that you could have repeated transactions in different blocks which get into the chain and so on, right? But there is a limit, so there's some they're just, with a single blockchain there's just a certain rate. You can't go more than that, right? So obviously we might think, what if we have more than one blockchain? So suppose this is G1 and suppose I have G2, right, and G3 and so on. Suppose I have multiple chains like this, right? And if I have, let's say, n chains, then my throughput goes up by a factor of n. Right, so whatever improvement you get over here, right, so you can, let's say you use a Bitcoin NG type of idea or a Prism idea or whatever. Whatever you do on one chain, you can keep it as it is, but you just have many chains, not just a single chain, right? And so each chain might, let's say, do something like Prism or Bitcoin NG, or it can be just plain Bitcoin like in its structure, right? But why have a single chain? Let's have n chains. And then you get an increase in n times, because each of them has a certain throughput and it goes up by a factor of n. Okay, so that's the basic idea. But the question is, does that make sense to do? And you might think about, let's say, financial transactions which take place nowadays. So is there a single centralized ledger in which every transaction is recorded? And the answer is no. I mean, even in our banking system, for example, there is no single centralized ledger which has every transaction, every digital transaction made by everyone, let's say, in the country. So how do they do it? Well, each bank will have its own ledger. Each, let's say, each branch even of a bank might have its own ledger. Of course, it's not necessarily a blockchain. It's some digital system. It's stored in some database or whatever. Right, and whenever you have any inter-branch transfer, then there has to be some communication between these two branches. Whether it's, let's say, a branch in Powai or a branch in Juhu, right? Two State Bank of India branches, right? Each of them doesn't have to know everything about what happens in the other branch. Only if there is an interbank transfer, there has to be some communication, right? And that scales up. I mean, you're not overloading any single digital ledger, right? And of course, between banks, if there is a transfer, there will have to be some communication between those, right? And again, if you have international transfers, then there has to be some communication. But but no single bank needs to know the transactions of all other banks, right? So maybe that idea is going to work out over here too. So you can think of each of these shards as being, let's say, one branch of a bank or whatever. And so intra-shard transactions are recorded here. So intra-shard means within the same shard. And that's not an issue at all. But the question is, what happens to intra-shard? Sorry, inter-shard. This is where the complication comes in. This is one issue. Which any particular sharding system will have to address. So how do you transfer assets, let's say, from one shard to another one? Right? Or it may happen, so suppose you think of a Bitcoin-like system. Suppose somebody has assets in multiple shards and he wants to use all of them in a single transaction. So can I put a transaction in the third shard and the input I take from these two shards? Right? That makes it a little bit more complicated. Right? But even if you just want to shift, let's say, money from one shard to another, then how do you do it? That is one issue. And all of this was not there in a single blockchain system like Bitcoin, right? Because you just had to point to the various blocks in the past which you were trying to use the assets from, and you just create a transaction, right? And everybody who was doing consensus had access to the full chain, so there was no issue at all. Okay, so another issue we want to consider is, what about doing consensus? That was a big issue itself, even for a single blockchain. So we said that we were doing POW for Bitcoin, and if we were using some other permission ledger, we might use something like PBFT. And that is something that we have to consider. Right? So if you think about POW, if there was a single blockchain, then of course all the hashing power was going in that single blockchain. Right? And it was very difficult for an attacker to take down that single chain. Right? But if you somehow divide your hashing power among them, then it may make each of these chains weaker compared to everybody doing hashing on a single chain. Then if an attacker focuses all his hashing power on a single chain, then maybe it's easier for him to cause a problem, right, in a single chain. Suppose the hashing power is divided by a factor of n over here, and we say that miners just choose, let's say, one of the chains, and they do consensus for one of the chains, right? So that's an issue we would have to consider if we are looking at pure POW blockchains, how to deal with it, right? How do you keep these chains secure if you're going to split up the miners or the consensus parties among these various nodes, right? And of course we might think, what if it's a permissioned scheme? Then what is it fair to assume that each of them has 1/3 who are less than 1/3 who are malicious, Byzantine, right? Does that make sense? There are also other issues. So suppose we are looking at just a POW system. The consensus is not final. So we said that you have to wait for something like 6 blocks, and under some assumption 6 blocks is enough, right, for you to ensure that a transaction is gotten to the blockchain. And that complicates matters when you do inter-shard transactions, So Suppose somebody puts a transaction here which is transferring assets to another chain. Can you actually use that asset in the other chain? Because what if that block gets removed, because of some attack? And then the issue is that if that block with the transaction gets removed, then the asset is still there in this chain and it's already been moved here, right? So tricky issues come up, right? So people have come up with all sorts of ideas, and some of the ideas use a combination of POW and PBFT. Right? They might start out with POW and then shift to PBFT for different chains, and once in a while go back to POW and so on. Right? So of course, when you shift from POW to PBFT, you would assume that somehow you manage to get less than 1/3 who are dishonest. Okay, so it's a easier said than done. So clearly you don't really have an n times increase because of these intra-shard transactions, right? So somehow we have to deal with that, and the solution you propose will depend on what type of consensus protocols you're using and so on. Right? So I wanted to talk today about a paper called Mitosis. This is a paper which appeared in, this is by Marson et al. So et al, you might be familiar with this term. It just means Marson and other authors. Okay. So this paper appeared in a conference called ACSAC 21. So it's one of the top conferences in security. So we know about the big four, which we've talked about, CCS and so on, and this is like just considered just one rung below those, but it's a pretty tough conference to get into. Okay? So this is a fairly recent paper, and it has a peculiar name, Mitosis, of course practically scaling permission blockchains. So we are going to delay the discussion of POW for a moment, and we'll focus on permission blockchains. So why use this peculiar term mitosis? Right. So mitosis is is a term from biology, and what is mitosis? Well, it's when you have a cell which splits up into multiple cells. And this is an idea which is going to be used in this paper. Right? So most of the earlier papers looked at a system like this, what I've shown over here, where you have n shards, and mainly they focus on this whole business of intra-shard and what consensus protocol to use where and so on. Right? Mitosis goes a little bit further than this, and it says, why do you have to have n chains? I mean, how would you know what n should be in the beginning? Maybe n is equal to 5 is good enough in the beginning. But then later on you find that even that is not good enough. Right? And maybe it's feasible, for the resources are enough to have a larger number of shards. Right? So instead of having 5 shards, maybe you have enough people who can do consensus for 10 shards. So why not allow more shards to be created over time? Okay, so that's the key idea. So n, the number of shards, changes dynamically. Right? So what they are saying is that a single shard could split up into more than one shard. Okay, so it's quite an innovative idea, and actually, to be fair, some people in our department, Professor Manoj's team, they have an idea called cell tree. Which is actually seems to be a more advanced version of mitosis, but and in fact maybe the Professor Manoj's team should have actually used the term mitosis for their idea, because they have this idea of cells. Of course, it's not as maybe as simple as what we will see here. It's a little bit more complicated, in that cell tree can even doesn't even have to have blockchains, okay, in each sort of shard, and I mean it's a much more complicated system. But his idea was he had it as early as 2018, 2019, okay, and I remember sort of being on evaluation committees for some of his students around that time. Okay, but those ideas were there, and of course there's some similarity to this paper. But I think the idea of having a dynamic system makes a lot of sense, because how do you know what you're going to need in the future, and so n changes. So basically he allows each shard to split up into more than one shard, right? So the basic method considered is one chain splits up into two over here, right? But you might think, what could you reduce the number of cells? And in fact they do allow that. So of course they mainly focus on splitting up, but you can also join cells together. So you can have two shards. Okay, I'll just say this is some similarities are there. So these two shards might be allowed to join together into a single shard. Okay. So what do we have to do when let's say this split happens or this join happens, right? So the state has to be split up. Okay, so of course in our system it's all about sharding, that I mean it's just that the term mitosis is used from biology, right? So we're just splitting up the shards. So what happens when a single shard splits up? Split means that the state of each state has to be divided. Right? And somehow that we'll have to figure out how to do that. Each shard should know what is its state. Right? Maybe there's a set of accounts, right? Which total set of accounts. Let's say there are 1,000 accounts here, and each say 500 goes here, 500 goes here. Okay? And right. Also, the consensus nodes will get split. Right? So let's say that there were 100 nodes taking care of consensus here, and maybe 50-50 gets split over here, or whatever, right? Whatever the split is that we do, right? And then of course each shard can run on its own, because they know what their initial state is when this split happens, right? So of course you might think this maybe there was a particular reason they chose permission blockchain, because in a permission system you assume that your consensus is final with something like PBFT. Once the consensus has taken place, let's say on a block, it's done. You don't have to worry at all about the block being removed sometime in the future or something like that, which happens in a permissionless system, right? So this split you can do right away once a particular block, let's say, is finalized in a particular shard, right? It would be much more trickier to do something like this in a POW system, right? Okay, so the state gets split, and then you would have to decide on which nodes get split. There would have to be a system of doing that, right? So since it's a permission system, let's say, of course, we can take care of state getting split, but can you guarantee that consensus will work fine in these two? Okay, so suppose I assume 1/3 of people, or less than 1/3, are dishonest here, and you're using PBFT. Suppose we are using PBFT in both these shards, then can you be sure that less than 1/3 are going to be dishonest in each of these? And so that's one of the focuses of the paper, where they do some analysis to show when this is going to work, right? So let's look at some of the details. So initially, of course, we have to form chains. So what they assume is there is some, let's say, some central registry and this is going to be used when we create a chain initially. Okay, so they assume that for chain C, there is a set of validators. These are sort of the consensus nodes, and then they have a set of clients, and these are like users. Right, and the consensus protocol they call some pi C. Right. So initially, of course, there are some assets. So AU is a asset of user U in the chain, right? And so they allow, of course, actually they are more, users are more general than just C. So then so CC union VC are the set of users. Okay, so initially, of course, the registry is used to set this up, right? And okay, so all this information, let's say, is there in the registry. Okay. Now, suppose let's focus on a single chain. So how to add, let's say, a validator. So this could be done, first of all the VC has to agree to add a new validator, and so let's say that U is a new validator, let's say U. So VC becomes just a union of this, right? And this is updated in the registry. Right? But a new client can be added without contacting the registry, right? That's what they say. That for example, you want to transfer assets to somebody else on a particular blockchain, somebody who's not already, maybe somebody who doesn't have an account, that can easily be done without contacting the registry. Maybe there is a particular public key for that new user, and you directly transfer it to that particular public user, right? But this central registry is what is going to be used to keep track of who are the validators for a particular chain. Okay. So this is about setting up a single chain. What happens when we actually split a chain? And that's really what we should be interested in. So chain splitting. Okay. So how are we going to decide to split a chain? So let's say that there are many shards. Let's say that let's focus on a single chain, and now we want to create two chains. So we have to somehow stop in between and somehow start these two chains like this, right? So this is like a genesis block for this particular shard, and this is, you have two chains over here, right? So let's just call this genesis of C, and this is genesis of C1, and this is genesis of C2, right? Okay. So when are we going to split? And then how is what we have to address, right? And so maybe let's say that as one of the things is that if the load goes up, there are too many transactions coming in here, maybe you can have separate shards, right? That is one thing. So the load of transactions is very high. So let's say the number of transactions gets coming into this particular system goes above a threshold, maybe they can decide to split, right? So that at least the number of transactions in each is let's say small, so that they're able to be processed fast enough, right? Otherwise maybe transactions will get backlogged for too long before they get into the chain, right? Or it could be that let's say that VC gets too large. Okay, so this is the size. Okay, so some reason like this, whatever the reason is, these are sort of proposed in the paper, but for whatever reason you might want to split up into multiple shards. Okay, the question is how to do it. I mean, because we want to split the assets into two different shards, and we also want to split the consensus nodes into different shards, right? So how are we going to do that, right? And how is it going to be initiated in practice? Okay. So so what is proposed is that one of the members, any particular party over here, who's one of the consensus nodes, can propose. So any member of VC can propose to split the chain. Okay, and that could be done, for example, by putting a transaction on the blockchain, right? And so maybe any particular node broadcasts a transaction proposing a split, and if that proposal is accepted by enough number of people, then of course the chain can be split. So let's say quorum of VC accepts, then the chain is split. So the proposal should say what, let's say, the new protocols are. So interestingly, Mitosis keeps it general enough. Let's say one chain wants to run Raft and one chain wants to run PBFT, right? So that's up to them, right? That's allowed, right? And whatever they propose, is fine, right? And so the registry is updated, the central registry. Updated with the new information. About C1 and C2. Right, so what is this new information? Well, it should have, let's say, what are the sets of consensus nodes, V1 and V2. Right, it should also have, let's call this VC1 and VC2. Right, and there should be some information about the assets, right? So what are the assets in each? Okay, so if you're doing just a split of accounts, at least there have to be a list of accounts in each. Okay, and there could be there's multiple ways proposed in the paper. Okay, there could be some deterministic way to do that, or some sort of randomized or pseudo-random way of doing it. Right? Okay, so this will have to be updated, and once this is done, then we are ready to go. So you can start adding blocks to C1 and C2. Right? Okay, so Okay, so this is a basic idea of how it's going to be done. Okay, and what about chain fusion? Okay, so this is not discussed in too much detail, but it's mentioned over here. And how would we do this? So here we would just have to, so here we are saying that C1 and C2, let's say, combine into a new chain C. Okay, so then VC is just going to be equal to the union and let's say the assets in C are going to be the assets in each of these. And of course the new consensus protocol has to be decided. Okay, so how would we do this? Well, of course, let's say each of these consensus groups has to agree, right? So let's say that a quorum in each of these has to agree to the unification, to the fusion of the chain, and that evidence has to be given to the registry, right? And okay, so when we go from here to here, I just have to put here that the evidence of quorum has to be given to the registry, right? And okay, so let's say that there is some trusted party running the registry, which could be allowed in a permission system, right? Okay, so this is the basics, and of course there is an implementation in the paper on Hyperledger funds. One of the tricky things to look at is how exactly are we going to do this split, because we're using things like PBFT, where the Byzantine percentage among the validators has to be smaller than a threshold. So suppose C has alpha Byzantine threshold. Okay, so suppose there are n validators, so that means size of VC is n, right? So F is the actual fraction, and this should be less than alpha n. Okay, so we are hoping, of course, that beta is going to be somewhat less than alpha, right? And suppose, so we are talking about splitting over here. And so C is getting split into C1 and C2. And here your requirements are alpha 1 and alpha 2. Okay, so you're using some consensus protocols. So suppose it is PBFT in both of these and you want these to be 1/3, right? But whatever your protocol is, you will have, and usually these BFT type protocols have some sort of a threshold for the Byzantine fraction, right? So suppose these are the thresholds that you want. This is the tolerable thresholds for the protocols being used. So this is a question that we have to address when we are dealing with splitting up, right? And so just because if you split this up, how are you going to guarantee? I mean, you want some sort of a guarantee, right? And here there is a problem because if you don't know who is Byzantine and not, then how are you going to guarantee it? What if all the Byzantine nodes go into one of the shards and then maybe the number or the fraction exceeds alpha 1? What if that happens? Right, so there are different cases considered. So case 1 is that let's say alpha 1 is equal to alpha 2 is equal to alpha, and beta is equal to, beta is, let's say, less than alpha by 2, and let's say that n1 is equal to n2, that's the fraction that you want in each. And let's say that's equal to half, right? So that is one example. In this situation where beta is less than alpha by 2, we have it easy because you can clearly see that the number of Byzantine nodes in the entire system in VC is less than alpha n by 2, right? And what we want is that the number of Byzantine nodes in VC1 or VC2 are less than what, alpha times, we have the same alpha, so but we have half the nodes in the system. Okay, so we want it to be less than this, right? So since the total number of Byzantine nodes in the entire VC is less than this, so obviously we're going to have less than alpha n by 2 Byzantine nodes in any one. It doesn't matter what division we use, okay? So any split of VC into VC1 and VC2 will work. So this is an easy case, right? So of course we might wonder, like, what are we gaining by splitting up? Well, it's sort of, you're giving less work to each participant because you don't have to be, previously each node had to be involved in, let's say, all the transactions, at least in doing consensus, had to be involved in all the transactions in chain C, whereas now they'll only have to deal with a subset of the state and a subset of the total transactions, right? Anyways, but here we are mainly interested in looking at whether we can achieve the limit of Byzantine nodes. In a more general setting, suppose we don't have it so easy, we don't have that the number of attacker nodes is, let's say, less than alpha by 2, or the fraction is less than alpha by 2. Then what's going to happen? So suppose we have f is equal to beta n by 2. This is the number of Byzantine nodes, and sorry, beta n, and this is less than alpha n. So we have a little bit of breathing room. Beta is less than alpha, but now we are going to, suppose we do a random split of VC into VC1 and VC2. Right? So we use some randomness in the system, maybe the hash of a block or something like that, which could be unpredictable. and we use that to split some nodes. Let's say we take a subset of these nodes and put them into VC and the rest into VC2. Right, so let's assume that each node in VC is sort of randomly assigned to VC1 and VC2. Okay. So now what guarantee do we have that that alpha, I mean the fraction of nodes here is less than alpha 1 n1. Okay, so is f1 less than alpha 1 n1, and we wanted f2, the total number of Byzantine nodes in VC2, is it less than alpha 2 n2. Right, so this is what we want to hold, and we can't be sure of it. I mean, if for example if alpha 1 and alpha 2 are equal to alpha, and if beta is not less than alpha by 2, then there's no guarantee that we're going to have this, right? But with some probability it's going to be true that indeed f1 is less than alpha 1 n1 and so on. Okay, so this is what the authors were looking at, and so they looked at a particular case. So they said, let's assume that n1 is equal to n2, which is n over 2. We are assuming that n is even, of course, and suppose alpha 1 is equal to alpha 2, which is equal to alpha. Okay, this is a tolerable fraction of Byzantine nodes. What can we calculate? Okay, so what we are doing is we are splitting up n nodes into two parts. Okay, and we are sort of randomly choosing a subset of nodes. Okay, we are choosing this randomly. Okay, so exactly, let's say we are doing an exact split into n over 2, right, and two subsets of size n over 2. Okay, so what is the probability, or what is going to be the distribution of f1 and f2? So essentially what we end up with is something called a hypergeometric distribution. So what is this hypergeometric distribution? Well, suppose you have, so this is of course a general case what they've given. So suppose there are n nodes, and we are going to divide, suppose there are m, let's say Byzantine nodes. Let's say the total number of nodes are n. Right, and what we are doing is we are selecting let's say, of course they've used n again in the paper, but let me just let's say selecting k out of n. Okay, and what we want to know is that okay, so and we are selecting this without repetition. right? So we're just choosing, we're taking them one by one, we are randomly choosing them one by one from this, and we're selecting k out of them, and we want to know what is the probability. Suppose we say that x is number of Byzantine nodes. We want to know what is the distribution of x. Okay, and this is given by this hypergeometric distribution. N minus m k minus small k and choose k. Okay, so this is the distribution. Okay, right. Okay, and of course the authors are looking at a particular case, and for our case what they end up calculating, they're using various bounds given in the literature. So probability that f1 is greater than alpha n over 2. This is when we fail to have the number of Byzantine nodes less than what we expected it or wanted it to be. This is going to be less than or equal to e to the power of minus alpha minus beta square n. Okay, so suppose alpha is 0.33 and beta was, let's say, 0.25. Okay, so this is 0.08, we get that. Okay, so and we have to square that, but if n is large, we see that this quantity is quite small. Okay, so this is a bound that is you can get from the literature. Okay, and they've just used it. Okay, but of course they claim that so this is from known bounds on this probability, but they claim in the paper that a good approximation is something better, probability fi is greater than alpha I n I believe this must be n by 2, but anyway, this is what is given in the paper. Summation k is equal to alpha I n by 2 to beta n beta n choose k n minus beta n choose n by 2 minus k. I think this should be, there's probably a mistake in the paper. N choose n by 2. Okay, so this is what they give in the paper, and they claim that this is a good approximation. Okay, or okay, no, I think what they've done is this is actually the value, and they numerically calculated that, and they showed how well they do. Okay, and they show that if beta is below if alpha is 0.33 and beta is 0.25, Okay, you can bound this probability, the actual probability is going to be very small, okay, for a large range of values of n, right? So there's no guarantee that you are going to always get, let's say, less than 0.33, less than one third of the nodes to be Byzantine in any one of the split chains, but you can guarantee that with high probability. Okay, I'll just write this alpha times n by 2. Okay, so this is about splitting chains. Okay, and you might want to think what happens when you join chains, right? And suppose you're given that fi is less than alpha I times ni, and if you're given that you're going to combine two chains in order to make a larger chain, then what can you guarantee about alpha and the new chain, right? So if alpha I is less than alpha and let's say for I is equal to 1 and 2, then on combining the chains, we can say that that the resulting, we can guarantee that f, that is the total number of Byzantine nodes in the new combined chain. Okay, so we are combining these. We can guarantee that f is going to be less than alpha times n. Okay, so that's straightforward enough. So what we haven't discussed is about how exactly to shift assets from one chain to another. Okay. That's something we need to discuss. So this has to be done correctly, right? And it's a tricky part because you have different sets of nodes taking care of consensus in different chains. So let's say that this is chain 1 and this is chain 2. How are we going to shift assets from here to here? It could be just some token amount, right? So maybe you're debiting some amount from this account and you're shifting it to this account. So how is that to be done? So there has to be some cross-chain interaction, right? And what they suggest doing is that suppose you want to transfer assets from here to here. First of all, there has to be some agreement over here. Right, so let's say we want to shift assets from C2 to C1, and maybe let's use the notation used in the paper. So they don't call them C1 and C2, we call them CS and CT. Okay, so we are shifting from CS to CT. So what should we do? So somebody has to initiate that. Let's say a particular node, a particular user says that I want to shift assets from CS to CT. Okay. Initiates this movement. Okay, so roughly at a high level, this is what has got to happen. So VCS agrees, right? And then what happens is that when this happens, when they agree, so the asset is locked in CS, right? So this is a generalization they are proposing, because maybe you see, maybe these particular nodes don't have full information about CT, right? VCS nodes may not know everything about here. So suppose you says I want to shift assets to such and such an account in CT, but maybe that account doesn't exist in CT, maybe it's violating some of the rules of CT. And since this is a very general system where I mean a completely different protocol, it could be used for consensus here or whatever, right? There could be some rules for the assets here, and maybe even when VCS has agreed to shift the asset there, maybe CT is not going to accept that asset for some reason, right? So what you do is you temporarily lock this asset over here, right? And now what happens, so now let's say that CT is okay, so and let's say you or whoever else, let's say, maybe to make it general, let's say UT initiates CT accepting this asset. Okay, and so how is this going to be done? So it provides a proof to CT let's say that let's say actually a quorum in VC has agreed right, and then let's say the result of this UT, let's say gives result of reply from VCT, this is in the new chain, to CS, okay, and it depends, like if CT has agreed, so let's say has accepted, then CS deletes the asset. Otherwise, if CT has refused to accept due to some reason, then as the asset is restored, in CS. Right, so this is a high level view of what exactly is done in the chain, right? So there is some ambiguity about who is actually going to communicate with CT and CS. So I've just generalized it to some UT and some US, right? Some particular users, but essentially they provide some functionality in order for all of these to happen. right? So really what you're doing is that if both chains are in agreement, then of course the asset has to be deleted here and it's shifted over there, it is inserted over there, right? But of course if CS has refused to even give the asset, then you don't have to bother CT. There is no way that user can provide a proof to CT, right? But it's also possible that if CS has agreed and CT refuses for some reason, then I mean, it's not that the asset should disappear into thin air, it should be retained over here, right? So what happens if some communication here is not done in between, you know, that could it be that the assets are locked forever? You know, what if the response of CT to this request to shift assets is not given to over here, right? What if that happens? That is not discussed, at least I haven't seen it very clearly discussed, right? But anyway, at a very high level, this is what mitosis does, and I think it's a clever idea because it is allowing chains to be created dynamically, which I think would be required in a very general system, right? You would want new shards to be created over time depending on the demand. You know, it's like sort of like you have nowadays, let's say web servers, right? And at the back end there are multiple servers, but if the load on the server increases, you want to have more instances, you know, to provide the service. And it's something like that happening over here. You might want to increase or decrease the number of chains, right? Of course, this is looking at a small part of the problem, but you know, looking at the number of Byzantine nodes and so on, and at a very high level, saying how to do transfer of assets from one chain to the other, right? But an actual implementation would require maybe looking at many other issues. And finally, what we would want to see is to do like a stress test. You know, suppose you have lots of inter-shard transactions, then what is going to happen, right? Is the system going to hold up or not, right? But the future of blockchain systems probably are going to have some sort of sharding, because clearly a single shard may not be enough for like a large scale system. You know, what if the government of India, let's say, wants to have a CBDC, which they are talking about right now, a central bank digital currency? Can they do it on a single shard? Probably not, you know, and maybe they will have multiple shards running, and the hope is that there won't be too many inter-shard transactions, you know. But something like mitosis may be a good idea to have in practice, where you can dynamically increase the number of blockchains or the number of shards that you have over time.